Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are getting relatively back to normal on this Wednesday morning. Weather is relatively back to normal, so it's good. A few points before I begin. There it is. Before I begin today's discussion, two important points. I'll give you another reminder about our next assignment or task that is due, and that's your midterm task, as I said on Monday, and I've stated that also on the updated syllabus and on the announcements I sent you. The university have changed the deadlines a little bit, so your new deadline for submitting the midterm task is March 12th. You submit that on Canvas. So if you have any questions about that, don't be afraid to come and talk to me about that during office hours or send me an email, and we can work this thing. The other thing, if you are a little behind in terms of going over the lecture and you need my help about that, so let me know and I can try and help you see what we can do. Again, as I said, you're not under any pressure to view the lectures of Wednesday on Wednesday. I do recommend you try and do it as much as you can. And also remember to send the attendance board. Otherwise, even if you watch the lecture, I have no way to know that. So please try and remember that. So on Monday, I had a pretty long discussion about introducing the psychological approach of IR, the effect that political psychology and focusing on the individual level of analysis has on explaining different events in political science overall, but particularly when it comes to international relations. I talked a little bit about the increase in the amount of research over the last decade or so and some of the reasons for that. We talked a lot about prospect theory as one of the main theoretical frameworks that are used to explain events when it comes to psychological explanations to IR, with the different elements, reference dependence, gains and losses, the fact that we tend to observe and interpret every situation we face in a relative sense, so not in a gross sense, but in a relative sense, whether we are gaining from it or whether we are mildly likely to lose from that. That leads to elements such as loss aversion. Our concerns about the potential loss are much stronger than the potential to gain something out of that behavior that we might want to enact. How that affects our risk behavior, whether we are more risk accepting or risk averse. I gave you the example of former Egyptian President Sadat in 1973, who went to war with Israel despite knowing that he's in a substantial disadvantage, but because he was in the domain of loss, he was willing to take the risk. We talked about the importance of framing as part of the explanation and the example of the Asian disease. And then I talked about a lot of psychological mechanisms beyond prospect theory. For example, emotions. How do different emotions affect our decision-making and behaviors that are engaged in political settings? Mostly the research showing that negative emotions such as anger, anxiety, fear leads to suboptimal choices. Also the effects of misperceptions and heuristics, and not evaluating the situation properly because of different psychological elements may lead us to overestimate our capabilities or our strength, and that can lead also to conflict. And lastly, I finished with the two main limitations of this approach. The first was the aggregation problem. How do we extend the opinion of one individual to the entire public? How to aggregate opinions? And the second was external validity, based on how do we take the opinions of you as a student sample and explain that with that the choices made by political leaders. If you have any questions about that, as always, you are more than welcome to email them to me. All right, so let's move on. I had a pretty long introduction of psychological approach on Monday, centered on studying individuals. And today we shift to talk about specific individuals in the IR and political context, which are leaders and elites. Now, the first question we can think about is, why should we care about specific leaders? And as this a little bit exaggerated picture is intended to illustrate, world leaders over the last 4 or 5 years have given us a lot of reasons to question their capabilities. But regardless, leaders have been part of the political systems and world politics forever. Despite that, serious theorizing about the role in shaping events had been relatively lacking. And there's been an increase in research over the last 10, 15 years, and some of the questions those studies address include: how do the leaders' background experience influence their decision-making in office. For our purposes, how does that affect their actions in terms of going into military conflict, joining an international agreement, or leaving an international agreement? How do the beliefs of those individuals influence the way that they perceive the intentions of others, right? So those beliefs by former presidents or existing presidents or prime ministers will shape how they view the intentions of their rivals or their allies, and that may affect their actions. What is the relationship between leadership turnover and conflict, for example, is a research question. The United States just went through a leadership turnover a couple of weeks ago. How would that affect any kind of international related event? So those are just some of the questions that the research addresses. In terms of the origin, so some have viewed the work by Morgenthau in terms of realism way back in the middle of the 20th century as the foundation for studying leaders. Now, it wasn't because he made any kind of calls to use leaders as a unit of analysis or focusing on leaders, but because his view was that the quality of diplomacy is the most important factor in international relations. The quality of diplomacy is culminating in the context of realism in shaping the balance of power, the most important factor in realism. Okay, this is an international system. But as I said in this slide, the architects, the ones that engage in diplomacy, are leaders. So on some level, maybe that's the original approach to the importance of leaders. A lot of those earlier studies focus on studying specific leaders in specific cases those leaders were engaged in, addressing all kinds of psychological aspects such as their personality, their beliefs, some of their life experiences. And those studies came mostly in the 1970s until the beginning of during the 1970s, early 80s, and then there was the decline, mostly because neorealism has become the prominent approach and the assumption of unitary actor in a system-focused theory. We talked about that. One of the main limitations that also contributed to that decline in research in the late 1970s and 80s is the fact that the difficulty to get access to information and to data in order to test any kind of theoretical arguments. A lot of those studies relied on case analysis of specific leaders. So studying Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis can provide a lot of information about the way that Kennedy behaved. It's a lot harder to draw inferences from that case to the way that leaders behave in international crises overall. We talked about the limitations of specific case studies in previous lectures. Now, over the last 10, 15 years, there's been really a spike in the use of different methodologies in studying leaders. Some of them include the collection of large leader-specific data sets. Another approach is the use of elite experiments, that is, surveys and experiments that being administered to different types of elites. And this is how we measure and test our different theories. The use of elite experiments provide us with two central benefits. First, it allows us to study their behavior with the same tools that we use to study mass political behavior. So I can use the same survey that you guys filled for a couple of weeks ago. You made this survey about nuclear powers and whether it was democracy or non-democracy. If I can use the same survey and study elites, study a group of congressmen, that provides me a lot of benefits. Also because that also allows me to use the same theoretical framework to explain the choices that you made along with the choices that are made by those politicians. Therefore, we address a lot of concerns about external validity and how much does a student opinion represent the behavior of elite decision makers. So that's the important role that elite experiments play. At the same time, they face considerable challenges. First of all, it's very hard to recruit a large sample of top decision makers. It's very hard to recruit all senators to join an experiment. They don't have a lot of time. They don't always have motivations to be part of those kinds of researchers because they may be concerned that it can harm them politically. The vast majority of studies that have relatively large samples of what's called elite decision makers usually rely on either samples of former politicians, which have a little bit more time maybe and are less concerned that it might harm them, or using all kinds of, we can call that on some level maybe pseudo elites, for example, recruiting junior military officers as an example for elite sample. So this is one point. The other point is the context itself, which is it's much harder to present real-world examples of foreign policy scenarios to politicians and actually get their honest answer, because they have incentives to engage in strategic behavior. Because that might, again, because their choices might have political problems. Even if it's former politicians, they might have those kinds of incentives, because saying this is what I'll do now, the way I see the situation, it's not necessarily what they would have done while they were in office. So that's a little bit of the background in terms of this research on leaders. And now I want to talk about specifically the different types of researchers that we have about that. So there are two views to studying political leaders, what's called two schools of thought. You had that in the paper by Horowitz and Furman for today. The first category suggests that leaders matter, but external factors are more powerful. And the second approach provides the leaders a lot more agency, a lot more power in shaping the effects, and arguing that characteristics and different preferences are very impactful in shaping international events. So let's talk about either one of those categories more specifically. The first is called the Institutional Leadership School. According to this category, leaders have relatively much agency when it comes to having an effect on events, and do have an effect. However, they are highly constrained by domestic and international conditions, which in essence makes their ability to have a clear effect on the events a lot more limited. Now, this is an argument which is a lot closer on some level to what realism suggests, or what neorealism suggests. Right? Neorealism suggests that leaders may have their different preferences. We don't care about that. That's what realism tells us. But what sets the outcome is the international conditions. Now, this is a more extreme version of this specific schools of thought, because according to the International Leadership School, there's still substantial weight given to the individual leader and her circumstances, but that leader, again, is highly constrained by the international system. One of the central themes that are studied in that is what's called leadership turnover. When leaders change, how would that affect the behavior of the country? So the United States just went through a leadership change when former President Trump left office and President Biden went in. How would that affect the different actions that the United States will be engaged in the international system? It's also important to think about that from the strategic perspective of how other leaders are viewing that change. How do allies of the United States or adversaries of the United States view the change in leadership in Washington? How would that affect their behavior? One of the potential implications of this strategic approach is that the risk of conflict. So, for example, a study from 2007 suggested that former Russian Premier Khrushchev instigated the Berlin crisis in 1961 in order to test the level of resolve that new American President JFK will display. When JFK went into office in January of 1961, Khrushchev was already in his position for over 6 years at the time. He didn't have enough information to understand how Kennedy is likely to approach the Cold War, the crisis of the Cold War, how resolve is going to be. So the argument in that paper is the fact that there was a turnover change in the United States led the Russians to implement that crisis. So that's one point in that. Now, a lot of this research is also based on large data sets. So I'll give you one example, just showing you. This is I made some, I cut some screenshots of the data sets called the Archegos data set, which focuses on political leaders. What you see here is the list of leaders. For example, this is the United States. So we have leaders from Reagan all the way to Obama, the date they went into office, the date they left office, the type of entry into office. Regular means that they just went in there after winning an election, coming out after either losing an election or ending their term. But we see that there are other values here. So for example, we have here natural death. So former Canadian Prime Minister MacDonald, way back in the 19th century, died while he was in office. So that's one way in which he left office. Now, all this information provides us, there's also ways here you see there's year born, year died, so we can actually think about their age as an individual level factor. But this type of information allows us to compute indicators for their tenure, for their time in office, which relate to the concept of turnover and can help us explain international events, whether they are conflicts, negotiations, whatever that may be. The second school of thought is called the leader attribute school. In this category, individual beliefs, attitudes, and experiences are important in shaping political preferences as well as political outcomes. This includes different types of factors. Some of them are fitting more to the individual characteristics, such as the leader's age. I show you the example from the Archegos dataset. The gender. There's a lot of research about whether the leader is a male or female. How would that shape the actions that they're taking? And a lot of research, and that's going to be our focus for the rest of today, will be about different life experiences, the level of education, whether the leader has a military or rebel experience in this case. How does that matter for their actions? Once again, another important theme in research about leadership in this school of thought is how those leaders affect public opinion. So a research from 2018 suggests that overall leaders seek to manipulate public support or domestic support for their policies because they want to enact different policies. So they're trying to affect on public opinion. How much does the public support those different policies? I'm sorry. And in terms of the elites that are part of this research, this research introduces the role that is being played by presidential advisors. Now, overall, the basic premise of the argument of this paper is that citizens overall are relied on cues from elites and politicians in order to shape their views about foreign policy. The main reasons for that is because we lack information. We don't have the same amount of information that politicians and those who are within the circle of foreign policy have. So we rely on their statements, on their press briefings in order to learn more about foreign policy. But because leaders want to push the public to support different types of policies, those leaders will actually bargain with their advisors, who are the experts, as part of shaping public attitudes. Now, one of the main propositions of the theory is that the public support will be lower if an advisor will speak against any types of policy that the leader is trying to implement. And if the leader will enact a policy opposing the opinion of his advisors, her advisors or his advisors, it's likely to lead to lower public support for that policy. Now, where does the individual attribute is being injected into this research is by looking at the type of advisors. And we're focusing here on hawk or dove, which relate to most foreign policy attitudes and conflict attitudes. So the effect of the statements by the advisor are more likely to be more powerful when they round counter to the type, which means that a hawkish advisor that speaks against the use of force is more likely to be more effective than an advisor who is a dove, because it makes sense that advisor whose type is a dove will speak against the use of force. And exactly the opposite as well. A dove which will speak in support of using force is more likely to have more effect. And if the hawk talks and opposes the use of military force, and the leader eventually decides to use force, it's going to be much harder for that leader, according to that paper and the evidence that they show, to gain public support for those policies. So this is just an example for one research that relies on those aspects, and how do we inject those individual elements into the research. I want to talk now more specifically about different applications of those schools of thought in different studies of political leaders and different types of international events. So first we'll talk about, before that, I missed that slide. The general, it relates to the general conclusion of all this research about political leaders in both schools of thought, but more primarily from the leader attribute school, is this: those leader-specific attributes are important for the way that leaders interpret information, and that's going to shape their behavior in international systems. So when two cases have the same type of information, and I gave you this example on Wednesday when I talked about the fact that Clinton and Bush faced the same type of threat in Iraq, but they behave differently, our focus can be on those leaders' attributes in order to explain the variations in the outcomes. So sorry about this missed slide. And now we'll talk about different applications. First is the Herman paper that you also had for today on the reading list. Professor Herman sits at the University of Syracuse. She's one of the most famous and veterans of studying foreign policy behavior, particularly when it comes to leaders. She's been doing that for over 40 years now. So this research that you had for today is one of the first that focuses on different leaders' attributes, but trying to provide us with a more systematic analysis of those attributes in explaining foreign policy decisions. She explores the questions of how different personality traits affect behavior. Her focus is on a very clear list of 6 personality traits, and she tested she tests how those personality traits affects the behavior of 45 world leaders. Now, an important question here is, why should we care about those specific traits or characteristics? And what she argues is that those characteristics directly lead to the formation of two different orientations that leaders have toward foreign policy and international affairs. So one of them is the independent orientations, which is a better reflected in aggressive types of behavior, aggressive leaders. The other one is the participatory orientation, which is more in line with a conciliatory type leader. And each one of them has a different implications when it comes to the type of actions that those policymakers are likely to engage in. Now, those characteristics which lead to those orientations interact with two other factors which are not directly related to individual leaders. The first is the level of interest, which is more direct, there's more connected to that. The other one is the level of training, which can also be viewed as the extent of experience that that leader has in foreign policy. And her argument is that the more interest leaders have in politics, the more likely that those personality traits will be more powerful, while the more training they have, those personality traits will actually be less powerful. That's one thing she argues. So this is the conditional effects of those factors along with those personality traits. She mentions different sets of characteristics and how they lead to those orientations. So she talks about beliefs, which are the fundamental assumptions of every individual about the world. And they are important for the interpretation of the environment and the preferred strategies of different leaders. Two of the central indicators she talks about here are nationalism, the extent of nationalism, and the belief of the individual in her ability to control events. The more you think you can control events, you're probably going to be more independent in your actions, and that's going to have very clear implications for the type of actions you're going to take in the international setting. Similarly, motives are the reasons for the observed behavior, and the characteristics in this case are the need for power, the need for affiliation, higher need for affiliation has important effect on type of actions they're taking. The third is the decision-making style, and that's the preferred method for making decisions. And the author focuses on the concept of conceptual complexity, which is the ability to process and structure information and understand what the environment tells us. And this is an important factor for predicting aggressive behavior. And the last one is the interpersonal style, which is how decision makers are dealing with others in the policy and decision cycle. And the focus here is mostly on the ideas of trust. How much you trust your advisors, your cabinet members, or your allies for that matter. Now, we can suggest that those different characteristics, some of them I've talked about now, fit a personal classification. But the main objective that Herman proposes here is to provide those more general types of attributes and have a more systematic type of systematic types of leaders. And for example, she suggests that when it comes to decision style, some leaders, based on those characteristics that she mentions here, favor a more centralized foreign policy process. So for example, if you take the American president, for example, a more centralized foreign policy will be a president that the vast majority of foreign policy actions are taken from the Oval Office, are initiated and are implemented from different advisors and agencies from the Oval Office. The other ones can be those that are more open and allow more room for the bureaucratic process in implementing policy. So for example, allowing a lot more power for the State Department in shaping foreign policy. Those are different styles, and that matters for the type of action taken. So what she does, she engages in content analysis of leaders' interactions with the press during the 1960s. This is actually one of the first iterations of what today is very prevalent, and it's called text analysis. She suggests that she wants to focus on press interactions because those are more spontaneous reflections of the leader's attitude rather than looking at speeches or letters which are written by in advance, in many cases have a very strategic content. So she wants to focus on a more spontaneous reactions. In terms of the specific procedures for that analysis, it relies on a very clear coding scheme, which tries to identify specific terms of words in the data, in this case, the press interactions, and how they fit to the definition of those different characteristics that she has in the theory. So for example, if she wants to measure nationalism, that is identifying specific words that describe that the leader views the nation as it's important that the nation will take center stage in the world, words that describe strong emotional ties to the nations, emphasis on honor and identity. So identifying those kinds of terms or words in this data represents higher degree of nationalism. And again, this is the basics of text analysis, which is very, very prevalent today. Some of her findings, you read a lot, she talks a lot about those findings in the paper. So for example, high degree of needful power and nationalism reduces the extent of accepting change. So those leaders are less likely to accept change in their policies. The idea of independent orientation, how would that affect ideas such as interdependence? We see here, I can show you here this table of correlations that again shows that those who display more of a participatory type orientation, this is a positive effect, a positive relationship with more of a cooperation types of behavior compared to nationalism. Higher degree of nationalism has a negative correlation. So the more you display nationalism, the less likely you are to engage in kind of participatory orientation or cooperative behavior. So those are some of the findings that she offers. Overall, she shows how the effects of past experience, which she measures in training in foreign policy, along with those dispositional effects, matter for foreign policy action. Now, this training in foreign policy will lead us to the next set of studies, which focus on another individual characteristic, and that's the effect of different experiences in shaping the behavior of leaders, mostly in the concept of international conflict. So I want to talk about the work by Horowitz and Stamm. The primary puzzle that they address is they want to answer whether past life experience, and for them it's military and rebel experience, matter for the behavior of those leaders in international affairs, and in particular in conflict situations. That the fact that a leader served in the military or saw combat or was part of a rebel group will lead to different reaction to a security types of threat. And they also motivate that by displaying this figure here, which shows that all the way from the late 19th century all the way to the end of the 20th century, the proportion of leaders that had this type of experiences is not insignificant. It's relatively high. Those who have rebel experience is relatively high, especially in the 1990s. Those who were both members of the military as well as saw combat was relatively high across the world, and that's across all countries and all the data they have. So this is an important factor. Now, coming back a little bit, taking one step back to talk about the theoretical argument, based on research in psychology, they argue that past events in life can serve as a frame of reference or heuristic, which is similar to what I talked about on Monday, and have an effect on the evaluation of the cost and benefits when leaders make decisions and select their strategies. Their focus, of course, is on being part of the armed forces. They suggest that experience in the military is very important for the risk attitudes of those individuals, because those who have that experience may be more risk accepting and view the use of force in a different manner than individuals that did not serve as part of the military. Now, what they're doing is that they're making a clear distinction between three types of these experiences: having military experience, having combat experience, and having rebel experience. So let's talk about that more specifically. The first category is just having military experience, which means that you serve in the military, you were never part of any kind of combat. In this case, the argument is that those individuals that have such background are more likely to view the use of force or the use of military as an effective solution to political problems. Why? Because my past experience in life have taught me that whenever we're facing any kind of problem, we're using military forces because I served in the military. So that's the argument. Now, this means that those kinds of individuals are more likely to solve any kind of political problems they face once they are in office as political leaders using the military. So they're more likely to engage in conflict. In contrast, they suggest that those who have a combat experience are a lot more conservatives when it comes to the use of force, mostly because they know what it means. They know what are the potential ramifications and costs of actually engaging in combat. So the argument here is that those that have combat experience, and of course they also have military experience, but they do have combat experience, those kinds of leaders, once they are in office, they're actually less likely to engage in a conflict because they know what it means to actually going into war. The third type is the rebel experience, and this is described as having past military experience outside the confines of a nation state. And the logic is that if you are participating in rebel forces, that represents a substantial risk, because being part of a rebel group is a direct threat to the state. And in most cases, you're more likely to lose. The state is more likely to crush those rebel forces. But having this kind of experience suggests that those individuals are more accepting of risk. And again, their risk accepting behavior means that leaders that have past rebel experience are more likely to engage in conflict. So to conclude, their argument is that having past military experience without combat experience, as well as having rebel experience, increase the likelihood of going into conflict. Those are more risk accepting individuals. Having combat experience reduces the risk of going into conflict. Those individuals will be more risk averse. Now, they suggest, of course, that those attributes are working along or interacting with the different political institutions, because those political institutions affect the screening of leaders into office, the types of individuals and whether they are to go into actually being leaders. So the past individual military and combat experience actually works in conjunction with the political institutions, and that also affects the selection of leaders into office. So for example, in political regimes such as militarized regimes, which are non-democracies, leaders are more likely to be more aggressive and be more risk accepting, because by being aggressive and taking risk, you're more likely to rise to power in those kinds of regimes. Right? If you're not willing to accept risk, you're more likely you're not a very aggressive person, you're not likely to be the head of a rebel group, which eventually might lead you to be a leader in those kinds of regimes. So the argument here, and that's their final model here, is those past life experiences, military, combat, whatever that may be, shapes the risk attitudes of the leaders. So this is the individual effect here. This is the leadership school, the leader attribute school parts of it that interacts with the domestic conditions, regime type, any other types of conditions, and that's going to shape the final outcomes. They test the theory with a data set of about 2,500 individual leaders from the late 19th century all the way to early 2000s. And they account for those effects with different factors. So let's see. What we have here is their main findings. On this figure, we have different categories of experiences. And on the y-axis, we have here the probability of what's called the mid initiation. Mid is the data set about that includes data about militarized interstate disputes. So what we have here is the probability that a country, in this case a leader, but again, it represents a country, going into war. The probability is from 0 all the way to 30% here, based on those categories. So what we see here, the higher the values that each one of those categories represent, the more likely that leader is to go into conflict. So what we have here is that those who have military experience, do not have combat experience, and have rebel experience, have the highest probability of going into conflict. Those who have just rebel experience, a little bit less, and those who have no rebel experience are a lot less. One of the important distinctions that I want you to come out of this study is those two factors here. Having military experience and having combat experiences provide this probability of what, let's say it's about 14%, something like that. But having military service and having no combat experience provided with almost 20% likelihood. So this a lot, it's not a lot, but a higher probability that those that do not have combat experience will be, in this case for us, more risk acceptant and go into conflict. So this is the main finding that you have out of here, which supports their main arguments. As I said, they also talk about the combination of those individual attributes along with the political institutions, and that's what you have in this figure. What you have here on the x-axis is the type of regime measured from -10 to 10 on what's called the polity scale. The polity scale separates countries into their different regimes. All democracies are giving a score of anywhere between 6 and 10. The United States was usually around 10, but it actually took a hit following the events of January 6th, but let's not go into that. Any countries which is rated between 6 and -6 is those countries which are in the middle between democracy and non-democracies. They are called anocracies on some level. And anywhere between -6 and 10, those countries that have this score are the clear dictatorships like North Korea, which we can think about as an example. What we see in this figure, again, the y-axis for this figure is the same, the probability of conflict. What we see here is how the attributes interact with the type of regime. So this line here represents having military experience, and having no combat experience. And this line here represents having military service and having combat experience. What we see here, well, when those two cross one another, then the effect between them, there's no difference between them, but we should focus on here when the confidence intervals are no longer overlapping, and those fit with types of non-democracies. So what actually this figure tells us, that in non-democracies, leaders that have military experience but no combat experience are actually more likely to engage in conflict compared to those that do have combat experience. That's the main finding that we have from here. Now, the lack of effect when it comes to democracies is mostly related to the argument that democratic institutions are pretty powerful when it comes to alleviating the effects of individual dispositions or individual characteristics. So individual attributes such as past military experience are a lot less powerful in democratic countries compared to non-democracies. And this is what the main thing that we can take out of this figure. Overall, what we learned from this study is it shows us the important linkages between background in military experience of leaders and their propensity to initiate militarized disputes and wars once they go into office. This leadership background communicates important information about basic behavioral tendencies and the beliefs of those individuals. And the past military and combat experience condition the way that those leaders view the use of force and helps us understand their approach to international conflict. So this is an important finding in this case. Now, a lot of research in this field addresses the effects of individual characteristics on behavior when it comes to a conflict setting. I want to talk about another leader attribute, but in a different aspect of international politics, and that's military alliances. So this is actually a pretty relevant contemporary topic. The question is, how much do countries or leaders are willing to contribute to different military alliances? How much are likely to what's called free ride a strong ally that provides this, and the way we view that is what's called a public good. So I'll stop for a minute and just explain what a public good is, because we haven't got to that point in the course. So we'll talk about it a lot more in future lectures. But the idea behind a public good, which is a type of product or the type of service that consumers are getting, and it doesn't matter how many consumers we have, and it doesn't matter how much each consumer essentially pays for that, they will get the same amount. And the example in this case is national security. It doesn't matter how much taxes I pay. It doesn't matter how much taxes a lot richer individual pays. And it doesn't matter whether you live in Texas or you live in California, you get the same amount of national security. That's the idea behind the public good. All of us get the same amount of national security from the federal government, regardless of our contribution. And that's a public good. The opposite for that is a private good, but I don't want to go into that. We'll talk about that in the future. Now, how can we think about a military alliance as a public good? The idea is, and we'll take as an example, we focus on NATO, all members of NATO benefit from the charter of NATO, which declares that attack against one member is like an attack against all members. So whether you are Iceland, whether you are Greece, or whether you're in the United States, you benefit from the charter that says that an attack on Greece means like attacking all those countries. So you get the benefits of the protection of the members of the alliances, right? At the same time, the idea of the public good is that even adding more members to the alliance does not reduce the amount of defense or the benefits that existing members get. So let's say that here we have Belgium. Let's just, for example, say Belgium is now the newest member of NATO. The fact that Belgium joined NATO does not reduce the extent of defense or protection that Italy or the Netherlands or Norway gets as members already. And that's the idea behind the alliance as a public good. Now, when it comes to an alliance which is backed by a strong power, the idea is that it is possible that having strong military alliance such as NATO will suffer because some of the weaker members will engage in what's called free riding because the alliance is backed by a strong power and nuclear power. So the idea behind that is that the weaker nations here, so let's just, without trashing every country, let's just take an example, Iceland, they will get the benefits of deterrence from the NATO alliance because it's backed by United States, a very strong power, but they will not contribute as much as you want. And that can link you back to some of the discussions that were in the media over the last 4 years when former President Trump talked about a lot, how much do other countries are willing to contribute to NATO compared to how much the United States contributes. But this point is not Trump wasn't the first to mention that. It was way back from Obama already a point that was made. Before going into that last research, I want to talk about, just give you the attendance word for today. So for today, the attendance word, the word normal, hoping that we're all getting back to some form of normal. But the attendance word for today is the word normal. Okay, so the research is a work by Professor Furman, which is a professor in our department here in Texas A&M. And he also relies on those attributes and past experience. And in this case, he talks about business experience at the executive level prior to taking office, and how does that, having that experience, affect the level of contribution that leaders make to a military alliance such as NATO. He argues that having such background increase the likelihood that those kinds of leaders will make smaller contributions to the alliances. And he measures those contributions in terms of defense expenditure, so investment in terms of money. And the reasons that he offers for why having that experience reduces their level of contribution is, first, because having this background of business experience, those individuals tend to display a lot more of an egoistic type of tendencies. They went through a socialization process in the business world, which led them to value a lot more their own financial self-interest. So they care a lot more about themselves. Combine that with a very strong belief in their ability to get what they want without paying as much. And this is based on high level of self-efficacy and feelings of power. So when you go through that past life experience of being a member of the business world and going through this entire process until you get to an executive level, these types of attributes are part of your experience, and they will make you less likely willing to contribute once you're in office. So to test the theory, he analyzes the defense budgets of 17 NATO allies without the United States. He does not take the United States as part of this analysis between 1952 and 2014, again, trying to assess whether variations in those business experience of the leaders of those countries affect their extent of contribution in terms of defense expenditures to NATO. And his findings overall support his proposition. So he finds that having business experience reduces the degree of growth in defense expenditures by an average of a little bit over 1% in the following year. So every country contributes a little bit more every year to NATO. But those that have this past business experience, their level of more support for more expenditures into NATO tends to be a little over 1% lower each year. And this is an important one, especially when he focuses on the three large European countries of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. He finds that for those leaders that have this background experience, this drop in investment is about 3% high, which is a lot more bigger than if you want to say 1% is not that big. Well, it's a lot of money. So even 1% is not insignificant amount of money. So overall, what we find in this research is how those past attributes, which have no connection to any kind of a military background, have an effect on those leaders once they go into office when they address questions that relate to military alliances, which are related to international conflict. And what this research offers us is to integrate both rational and psychological arguments, when you think about those points here, into the explanation that places a lot more focus on the leaders themselves. And that's part of the reasons that we view the different outcomes. How much do different countries provide support for an alliance such as NATO? Okay, so if you want to read more, I highly recommend those studies. Professor Lupton from Colgate does a lot of interesting work about past military experience, and she looks here. This is a study about policies when it comes to domestic politics. And this work by Professors Barnes and O'Brien focus on the gender of leaders as an individual attribute and how that affects their actions in the international system. Those are all very interesting studies that I highly recommend if you're interested in this topic. That's it. With that, I am done for today. And if you have anything, of course, you're more than welcome to email them to me. Again, reminding you the midterm test. Don't forget to start working on that. Find the podcast you're interested in and try to listen to that in your time and start working on that. If you have any questions, as always, you're more than welcome to contact me. That's it. I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.